Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us some really compelling source material today, and yeah, we're ready to jump in.
We are indeed. We're taking a close look at one of the most, transformative periods in human development, cognitive growth during middle childhood.
That's roughly ages 7 to 12, right?
Exactly. And your collection of notes, articles, research, it gives us a really rich landscape to explore how children's minds fundamentally change during these really crucial school years.
Okay, so our mission today is to navigate this material together. We want to do more than just summarize facts. We want to extract the key insights, maybe some surprising twists, and definitely the practical takeaways.
Right. The goal is for you, the listener, to walk away with a deeper understanding of this complex stage pretty quickly and effectively.
We'll be looking at the big theories, how memory works, language, schooling.
And even grappling with that big question, what does intelligence really mean at this age? It's a lot to cover.
It sounds like a fascinating journey. Okay, let's unpack this.
So when we look at this period, a really foundational figure is Jean Piaget. He gave us this powerful framework, viewing children's thinking as progressing through distinct stages.
And he saw preschoolers quite differently, didn't he?
Yeah, he described them as being in the pre-operational stage. Their thinking is still heavily influenced by, how things look, often quite egocentric.
Meaning they can't easily see things from another person's point of view.
Exactly. And importantly, they lack what he called operations, these organized, logical mental processes.
Right, those mental tools. But Piaget said something really significant happens around age 7.
That's the shift, the entry into the concrete operational stage. The major development here is that children develop the capacity for logical thought.
Okay, logic starts kicking in.
And this is really key. This logic is applied to concrete problems, things they can actually see, touch, or directly experience. It's not abstract logic yet.
Gotcha. So what are some of the hallmarks of this new concrete operational thinking? What do we actually see?
Well, the sources highlight two big ones, reversibility and decentering.
Reversibility?
Yeah.
Like understanding you can reverse actions in your head.
Precisely. Think about pouring water from a tall, thin glass into a wide, short one. A concrete operational child knows you can pour it back and have the same amount. They understand the process is reversible.
Ah, okay. And decentering.
That's the ability to focus on multiple aspects of a situation at the same time, instead of just like the most obvious one.
Yeah.
So in that water example, they can consider both the height and the width of the glass.
Not just how tall the water looks.
Right. And putting those two together, reversibility and decentering that, unlocks their ability to solve conservation tasks. They realize quantity doesn't just change because appearance does.
That feels like a fundamental leap in understanding the world. Piaget was so influential in describing this, but the sources also mention criticisms, don't they?
They do. I mean, his descriptions were incredibly insightful, spurred tons of research. But some argue he, maybe underestimated children's abilities, suggested some skills might emerge earlier than he thought.
And his methods maybe had limitations.
Yes, often based on clinical interviews. And crucially, critics point out that Piaget didn't give enough weight to the role of culture and education.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah, research shows that the age children master things like conservation can actually vary depending on their cultural experiences, their schooling, stuff like that.
So the practical takeaway here for you listening is, this shift Piaget described helps explain why having a conversation or solving a problem with a 10-year-old feels so different from a 4-year-old.
It's not just more knowledge. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the world right in front of them, using logic on concrete things.
Okay, so moving on from Piaget's stages, let's look inside the brain a bit more. The information processing perspective offers another angle, right?
Exactly. It's less about these big sweeping stages and more about the mechanics, how kids actually handle information.
So how is that processing changing in middle childhood? What are the key developments?
The sources note a really significant increase in sophistication and also capacity. Kids get better at processing information as they move through these years. Their ability to take in, store, and manipulate information grows quite a bit.
And a lot of that is tied to memory improvements.
Absolutely. Remember, that whole process of recording, storing, retrieving information is key.
So what specifically is developing in memory?
Well, core functions like encoding, getting information into a usable form, and retrieval, pulling it back out when needed, they just become more efficient.
Okay.
And a really significant change is the marked improvement in short-term memory capacity. They can hold more chunks of information in their mind at once.
Which is vital for things like following multi-step instructions or working through a math problem, I imagine.
Totally. And this is also the period where kids start to understand their own memory. That's a big step.
Ah, meta-memory. That's the term, right? Understanding how your own mind works.
Exactly. Metamemory emerges and strengthens. And this awareness allows them to start using control strategies, basically, deliberate tactics to help them remember things better.
Like, just repeating something over and over.
Yep, that's rehearsal. Classic one. The sources mention other strategies kids can be taught, too.
Such as?
Things like organization grouping related items together. All the fruits, all the vegetables. Or the keyword strategy, linking a new word to an image or something familiar.
Okay.
And cognitive elaboration, which is connecting new information to stuff they already know, making it more meaningful. These are all types of mnemonics.
So memory tricks, basically.
Kind of, yeah. But what's really crucial, and the sources emphasize this, is that it's not enough just to know how to use a strategy. They also need to develop the metamemory to know when and where a particular strategy is actually going to be effective.
So it's about becoming a more strategic learner.
Exactly. Think about watching a kid trying to memorize multiplication facts or a spelling list. They might start simply, but teaching them these strategies consciously, that can be a real game changer for their learning. They start taking control.
Okay, so this developing mind, it's getting more logical, memory's improving, but it's not happening in a vacuum, is it? Vygotsky comes into play here.
Right. Vygotsky really emphasized the child's active role in learning, but also, crucially, the profound impact of social interaction and culture.
So learning isn't just this internal thing. It's heavily shaped by the people and the world around them.
Precisely. Vygotsky's ideas, they underpin a lot of modern educational approaches. Things like reciprocal teaching, cooperative learning groups, they all build on that idea of social learning.
And language is a massive tool in all this, developed through that interaction. How does language itself change during middle childhood?
Well, the basics are often there from preschool, but middle childhood brings this increasing linguistic sophistication. Their mastery of grammar improves significantly. Their vocabulary explodes.
Yeah, you notice they start using bigger words.
Definitely. And pronunciation, intonation become more adult-like. But a really big one is pragmatics.
Pragmatics. That's the social rules of language.
Exactly. How do you talk differently to your teacher versus your best friend? How do you ask for something politely? How do you understand hints or sarcasm? That's all pragmatics.
That's something you really see developing, the nuances of conversation.
Right. And closely related to that is metalinguistic awareness.
Thinking about language itself.
Yeah, the ability to understand your own use of language. This is super important for reading comprehension, for figuring out meaning when maybe things aren't perfectly clear.
What's really interesting, and the sources point this out, is how this growing language ability connects to self-control. How does that work?
It's a powerful connection. Children start using language internally, that self-talk, to regulate their own behavior.
Like talking themselves through a task.
Exactly. To plan actions, solve problems, inhibit impulsive reactions. Their ability to guide themselves using inner speech grows significantly as their language skills become more sophisticated.
So when you see a kid carefully explaining the rules of a game, or maybe muttering instructions to themselves while they're building something complex.
That's not just talking. That's their language, actively helping them structure their thoughts and manage their actions. It's a huge step toward greater self-regulation.
Fascinating. And where does all this cognitive growth, the logic, the memory, the language, really get put to the test and nurtured?
Well, the school environment is obviously huge. And one area where the sources dive pretty deep is bilingualism.
Right. Speaking two languages, the sources talk about different ways this happens in schools, don't they?
They do. Things like bilingual instruction, where kids learn in their native language while also acquiring English, versus immersion, where they're pretty quickly put into an all-English setting.
But the key takeaway isn't just the teaching method, it's the impact of being bilingual itself.
Yes, exactly. The research suggests bilingual children often show some real cognitive advantages.
Like what?
They tend to outperform monolingual kids on tasks that require metalinguistic awareness, that ability to think about language structure we just mentioned. They often show better representational flexibility, kind of like mental juggling.
Okay.
And frequently more advanced memory skills. Plus, of course, the obvious social, cultural, and even economic benefits later on.
So for listeners considering language learning options for kids in this age range, that potential cognitive boost is definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. The sources also broaden out a bit to discuss general schooling trends. In developed countries like the U.S., primary school is, a universal legal requirement,
Yeah.
a fundamental right.
Though, sadly, that's not the reality everywhere. The sources mention the gender gap in education in many developing countries.
A critical issue. In the U.S. specifically, some current trends noted include a refocusing on foundational skills, the basics increased accountability for both students and teachers.
Performance metrics and testing.
Right. And also a greater emphasis on addressing student diversity and inclusion within the classroom, making sure schools work for everyone.
One debate highlighted in the material is whether schools should be explicitly teaching emotional intelligence.
Ah, yes, EI. This concept, popularized by Daniel Goleman, involves skills like assessing your own emotions, evaluating others, expressing yours appropriately, regulating them, that kind of thing.
And the argument is that this should be part of the standard curriculum.
That's what proponents argue, yes.
Yes?
They say it's essential for producing well-rounded, capable individuals. But there are critics
Who say?
that nurturing emotional intelligence is primarily the role of families, and schools should stick to academic subjects. It's a debate.
So where do the sources land on this?
They acknowledge the debate about where it's best taught, but note there's pretty general agreement that emotional intelligence itself is important and definitely worthy of being nurtured in children, one way or another.
Okay, so we've talked about the school environment. What factors actually contribute to kids succeeding academically there and maybe beyond?
It's definitely more than just turning up each day. The sources really stress school readiness.
And that's not just about age, is it?
No, not at all. It's about the child's overall developmental readiness, cognitive, social, emotional, physical. Interestingly, the research cited suggests that delaying school entry, like holding a kid back a year, doesn't necessarily help. It might sometimes even be detrimental.
So starting when they're genuinely ready, developmentally speaking, seems key.
Seems to be, yes. And central to school success, of course, is reading skills.
Which develop through stages. The sources get into that whole debate about how best to teach reading, right? Code-based versus whole language.
Exactly. The code-based approaches focus on phonics, understanding the sounds letters make, cracking the code. Whole language approaches emphasize recognizing whole words, getting meaning from context. Is a big debate for a while.
And where does the consensus lie now, according to the sources?
The current thinking, supported by the research mentioned, leans pretty strongly towards code-based approaches being more effective, especially for teaching those foundational reading skills initially.
Okay. Another factor mentioned, which might be a bit surprising, is the teacher expectancy effect.
Yeah, this one's fascinating and kind of powerful. It's the idea that an educator's expectations for a child, positive or negative, can subtly influence how they interact with that child.
Which in turn can actually affect the child's behavior and performance, creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's the idea. It highlights how much holding high but realistic expectations for students really matters.
And maybe less surprisingly, the home environment plays a massive role.
Absolutely huge. Things like creating a literacy environment, having books around, reading together, just talking to your child a lot, providing a quiet space for homework, encouraging problem-solving skills.
These are all cited as significant contributors.
Yeah, and these aren't just abstract concepts. They're concrete things you, as a listener involved in a child's life, can actually do to support the cognitive leaps they're making during these years.
That leads nicely into exploring the different paths families might choose for education. The sources look at alternatives to traditional public schooling.
Right. First, there are charter schools.
Mm-hmm.
These are publicly funded but run independently.
What are the arguments for and against them?
Well, proponents point to their flexibility, maybe more innovative teaching, or the ability to offer specialized or targeted instruction. Critics, on the other hand, raise concerns about them potentially siphoning funds away from traditional public schools.
And how do they actually perform?
That's where it gets tricky. The sources note that the data comparing charter school performance to traditional public schools is pretty mixed. It's not a clear-cut picture.
Okay. Then there's homeschooling,
where parents take on the role of educating their children at home. Proponents often point to standardized test scores and college acceptance rates that are comparable to public school students.
But what are the concerns critics raise?
Often around potential limitations in social interaction, exposure to diverse viewpoints, maybe gaps in specialized subjects like advanced science or tech, depending on the parent's expertise or resources.
And the data on effectiveness.
The sources mention there's a lack of comprehensive, unbiased data that really settles the question of long-term effectiveness compared to traditional schooling.
Yeah.
It's complex.
So understanding these different options and the debates around them really highlights the choices families face.
Yeah, definitely. And it leads us right into one of the most fundamental and honestly most debated questions when we talk about cognitive development. What do we actually mean by smart? What is intelligence?
Tricky question. The sources define it broadly. Something like the capacity to understand the world, think rationally, use resources effectively when facing challenges.
That's a good working definition. But they also acknowledge how difficult and, frankly, historically variable that definition has been. It changes.
Modern intelligence testing owes a lot to Alfred Binet, right?
Huge legacy. He developed tests mainly for a practical reason, to predict school success in French schools. His work gave us the concept of mental age.
Which indicates how a child performs relative to the average child of a certain chronological age.
Exactly. Which then evolved into the intelligence quotient, IQ, a score that allowed for comparison across different ages.
Though the calculation has changed, now we mostly use deviation IQ score.
Right. Comparing a child's score to the average performance of other children in their specific age group makes comparisons more stable.
And the sources mention some standard tests used today.
Yeah, familiar names like the Stanford Binet, the SB5 is the current version, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, WISCV, famous for separating verbal and nonverbal abilities, and the Kaufman Assessment Battery, KABC, which looks at different processing styles like simultaneous versus step-by-step thinking.
But measuring intelligence isn't straightforward. There's potential bias in traditional intelligence testing, right?
Absolutely. This is a major point in the sources. A person's cultural background, their life experiences, can significantly influence how they perform on these tests.
Which could put kids from different cultural contexts at a disadvantage.
Precisely. This was central to those really heated debates about average score differences sometimes observed between racial groups. You might remember the controversy around the book, The Bell Curve.
Which argued those differences were largely genetic.
Yes, but the sources are very clear. While differences in average scores were sometimes found, the idea that these were primarily due to heredity rather than complex environmental factors was not accepted by the vast majority of experts in the field.
So the prevailing view today,
As noted in the sources, it's that IQ, whatever it measures, is the result of a really complex interaction between nature and nurture. Genes and environment are deeply intertwined. You can't easily pull them apart.
and because a single IQ score might not capture everything, the sources also present alternative conceptions of intelligence, moving beyond just one G factor.
Right. Like the distinction between fluid intelligence, that's your raw processing power, reasoning, memory speed, and crystallized intelligence, which is your accumulated knowledge, skills, strategies learned over time.
Fluid might decline a bit later in life, but crystallized can keep growing.
Generally, yes. Or you have Howard Gardner's theory, which is quite popular. He proposed not just one general intelligence, but 8 distinct independent intelligences.
Things like musical intelligence, spatial, interpersonal, recognizing different kinds of smarts.
Exactly. And then there's Sternberg's triarchic theory, breaking intelligence into 3 interacting aspects. The analytical or competential part, book smarts, the creative or experiential part, thinking outside the box, and the practical or contextual part, street smarts, adapting to situations.
These alternative views seem really valuable. They push back against this narrow definition of smart and encourage us, to recognize a much broader spectrum of cognitive strengths in kids.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the final section in the sources, looking at the full range of cognitive abilities, children who fall significantly below or above that typical average.
Okay, let's start with those below the norm. The term used is intellectual disability.
Right. And it's important to note this isn't just about having a low IQ score. The definition requires significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior.
Adaptive behavior being those practical skills needed for everyday life, like communication, self-care, social skills.
Exactly. It affects about 1 to 3% of the school-age population. The causes can vary. Sometimes it's familial, meaning no obvious biological cause, but maybe a history in the family.
And other times there are specific biological causes.
Yes, the sources mention things like fetal alcohol syndrome, Down syndrome, or complications during birth like a lack of oxygen.
And the degree of disability is often categorized based on IQ ranges, right?
Generally, yes. From mild, IQ around 50, 55 to 70, where individuals can often live fairly independently with some support, through moderate, severe, down to profound, IQ below 2025, which requires much more intensive lifelong support.
Okay. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have children above the norm, usually labeled gifted and talented.
Defining giftedness precisely is actually quite tricky. There's not total agreement. But it generally refers to kids showing really high performance capability in areas like intellectual pursuits, creativity, arts, leadership, or specific academic fields.
And the sources mention something about stereotypes here.
Yeah, contrary to those old stereotypes of gifted kids being socially awkward nerds, research actually suggests they're often quite outgoing, well-adjusted, and popular.
So how are gifted students typically educated? What are the approaches?
The two main ones discussed are acceleration and enrichment. Acceleration means moving them ahead faster, letting them tackle more advanced material, sometimes even skipping grades.
And enrichment.
That involves keeping them at their grade level, but providing opportunities to explore topics in greater depth, doing more complex projects, broadening their learning within their peer group. Both aim to provide the right level of challenge.
Understanding this wide spectrum, from intellectual disability to giftedness, really underscores that cognitive development unfolds across a vast range.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And it requires very different kinds of support and opportunities to help each child reach their unique potential.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated quite a landscape, mapping these cognitive shifts of middle childhood.
Yeah, from Piaget's ideas about concrete logic taking hold to the development of memory strategies, how language becomes this tool for self-control.
The impact of school and culture, bilingualism, wrestling with what intelligence even means.
And looking at that full spectrum of abilities, from intellectual disability to giftedness.
It really highlights just how profound the transformation is in children between, say, age 7 and 12. It's building that cognitive foundation for everything that comes next.
Understanding this period isn't just, academic knowledge. It really helps make sense of the kids, how they learn, how they interact, how they're figuring things out.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe how we can best support their growth.
It underscores that there's no single path, no single measure of success or smartness.
Absolutely.
And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. How does recognizing these many different ways kids think and learn, appreciating their unique strengths, their potential beyond just simple labels or test scores, how might that change the way we interact with and encourage the young people in our lives?
It's something to think about.